We want to begin with prayer, and I invite us to pause for a moment of silent prayer, to breathe deeply of the Spirit, to rest in God's presence, and then I will close with a few words. O God, giver of all good gifts, we thank you for the gift of leadership that you give to guide the church, to call us to maturity in you. And this morning we give you thanks for Betty and for the gifts she brings to us, calling us to listen deeply to you, to listen deeply to one another. Fill her with your joy and your peace. May we be encouraged and challenged for how we can orient our lives during a time of discernment and change. Amen.
It has been 2 years since my husband and I moved into our current home. And in these 2 years, we have spent significant time trying to grow a vegetable garden. In spring, I venture into the garden full of hope. Each year I think, this year it'll work out. That's my dream. Unfortunately, by the end of each summer, my garden, once so full of hope, is wild and unruly. It looks a bit more like this. Holidays pull me away from my plot. I lose patience with the never-ending tendrils of bindweed. I become discouraged with my paltry harvest, and to be honest, sometimes I just plain forget about it. In other words, while I begin each year with tremendous hope, I am forced to surrender each year to the chaos of wild disorder. Maybe it is because of this yearly dance between things wild and things hopeful that I find the title for our assembly so provocative. I love this title, Wild Hope. From a gardening perspective, might there be hope even in the wild nature of my garden? Or in spring, could my imagination benefit from a dose of wild mixed with my post-winter hope for a weed-free plot and abundant harvest? Wild hope, faith for an unknown season. Our theme speaks to me of risk, of faith in the truest sense of that word, of throwing open the boundaries of what is in order to allow something new to emerge. Next week, it will be exactly 21 years since I officially became a mediator and consultant. Over these years, I have walked with churches of all spiritual types and from a wide range of denominations, often through times of significant trial and transformation. Consistently, one of the messages that I receive from congregations is this: despite what any congregation might be going through internally, there is a larger and much bigger issue that we are facing collectively as a people of faith. Our culture at large is changing rapidly, and so far at least, this change is leading people away from the church at an alarming rate. In some of our sister denominations, the decline is so steep and so rapid, you could argue that they are in free fall. While other denominations are not doing quite so badly, let no one be smug. The change the church is facing today affects every congregation, whether the congregation realizes it or not. Along the way, I have heard people in the pews and even some pastors say, "Why bother? Why not just close the doors? The church has obviously got it wrong, and it will never get it right. The church is far too liberal, conservative, out of touch, consumer-oriented, insular, lacking in spiritual depth. You can fill in the blank as you wish. For every person still attending church, there are more that have left. These are hard times for the church. I will confess that several years ago I felt discouraged. I even wondered whether I would need to switch my professional focus in order to have work into the future. I am not discouraged today. I feel a kind of a hope, perhaps even a wild hope for the future of the church. Let me tell you why. Let me tell you why. When we look back to the 16th century Reformation, we typically cast our eyes to our Anabaptist forebears, looking to them for guidance. This is well and good. It makes sense. But I wonder whether we should be focusing our gaze just as strongly on the Catholic Church from which we emerged. Both the 16th century Reformation and the unknown season that we are in today were created by multiple factors. When we look closely, we see interesting parallels. For example, in both centuries, there was an intellectual ferment that developed over several years before the church was directly impacted. So slowly, this ferment impacted the way in which people thought about their world. And in both centuries, it was a change in media that propelled these new ideas forward. In the 16th century, it was the printing press. In the 21st century, it's forms of social media. When we consider the parallels between these two centuries, we would do well to remember that today we are no longer the radical reformers. Instead, like the Catholic Church of yore, we, together with many others, are the established church from which people are leaving. In other words, our place as a denomination in this era parallels more closely the Catholic Church of the 16th century than it does the early Anabaptists. It is worth thinking about what we can learn from the Catholic experience of the Reformation. I am not suggesting that we begin burning at the stake those who are leaving the church. Although I might argue that there are multiple ways in which we today also demonstrate analogous defensive reactions. What I am suggesting is that when the Catholic Church was under threat, two distinct paths emerged. One path was the defensive one, which fought back hard against the emerging church of its day, including our Anabaptist forebears. Most of us would agree that that path of defensiveness was abhorrent. In contrast, there was a second path, which I would suggest to you is a much more delightful one that we want to learn from today. This second path was the path of deep and profound spiritual renewal. Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Ignatius of Loyola, these were the leaders of the Catholic renewal. In their own way, each of these leaders had a deeply transforming encounter with God's presence. And from this place of having been transformed themselves, they encouraged those who would follow them to likewise be transformed into the likeness of Christ, a likeness marked by profound humility, courage, love, and grace. That the Catholic Church found itself struggling between these two paths should not surprise us. Whenever people of faith have found themselves under threat, they have been forced to choose from three choices, actually. The choices are as follows. Do we fight back? Do we give up altogether? Or do we discover all over again who we are meant to be as children of God? It is interesting to me that much of what we know today as the Old Testament was written during the period of history when the children of Israel were exiled in Babylon. You know the famous psalm, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we wept when we remembered Zion." Like the 16th century, the children of Israel were faced with these same three choices. Do they fight back? Do they give up altogether? Or do they discover all over again who they were meant to be as children of God? They chose the last option. In that strange and foreign land of Babylon, the people began to write down their stories. And as they did, they discovered all over again who they are meant to be as children of God. The church today is in an internal exile. No, we haven't been kicked out of the promised land, but you could say that the promised land has been kicked out of us. The church is no longer at the center of society, and even more confusing, even if the church was at the center of society, the society that we're living in is changing at lightning speeds. Social norms, mobility, technology, how people think and behave, all of these are in a time of tremendous upheaval. It is no wonder that the church is having trouble finding its footing. And my response to this is this: what an incredible opportunity and invitation this upheaval provides for us. Like our Israelite and Catholic forebears, we have in this generation an opportunity to discover all over again who we were meant to be as children of God. This is good news. It is also the only thing that will meaningfully save us and offer us hope for this unknown season that we are in. So how do we do this? How do we discover all over again who we are meant to be as children of God? What we are talking about here is an invitation into significant and profound transformation at a personal level, at a congregational level, and at a denominational level. I would suggest to you that there are 3 spiritual rhythms that we as a church are invited to live into in order to embark on this journey of transformation. These 3 rhythms are as follows: surrendering, abiding, and incarnation. And as the slide shows, these three tend to follow a journey down before they follow a journey up. In a way, it is a journey into death before it is a journey into life again. Let me explain. Surrender. When I was a child, I loved to sit next to my beloved grandmother, listening to her stories about the many challenges that she had weathered in life. I had an insatiable curiosity for the life that she had led. She told me stories about the Russian Revolution, life under Stalin, her harrowing journey through Europe during the Second World War, homesteading in the jungles of Paraguay, and finally starting all over again in Canada. While the stories were fascinating, the greatest truth that emerged for me from all of these stories is this: exile journeys are faith journeys. Exile journeys are faith journeys because more than in any other time in one's life, it is while we are in exile that we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that we are not in control of our destiny. And when we give up that illusion of control, we finally are able to surrender ourselves fully and wholly to the God in whom we place our trust. For us to discover all over again who we are meant to be as children of God, especially in this time of exile, we as a congregation, as a group of congregations, as a church together, must begin walking that journey of surrender. It is a spiritual discipline to surrender, with emphasis on the word discipline. Surrender is just not so easy in a culture focused on self-esteem, wealth management, and pathways to success. Many of us, if we were to think about surrender at all, would probably prefer to partner with God rather than surrender to God. Surrendering to God is not something that we can do intellectually, nor does surrender to God simply ask of us to reaffirm old truths on which we tend to hang our hats. Surrender is a full body experience. To surrender to God is to surrender our minds, our hearts, and our wills. It is to live fully into the words of Jesus when he tells us to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your strength, and spirit. While we can do this individually, For this unknown season, we are also being asked to do this collectively as a church, as a people of faith. When we surrender our mind, we ask God to help us to see, to really see ourselves with fresh and honest eyes. It is no surprise to me that the first step of those following the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, that first step is to admit that one is an alcoholic. To surrender our mind is to become aware, truly aware of our current reality, and rather than fight this reality, to simply accept the potentially hard and troubling truth that this reality is. To surrender our heart is to ask God to help us to hear. To really hear with fresh ears how those around us have experienced us personally and collectively as the church. And to surrender our will is to ask God to help us to be fully dependent on God for our future rather than insisting on controlling that future ourselves. In my experience, it is the surrender of the will that is the hardest actually to do. Many of us can imagine what it might mean to surrender our hearts and our minds, but most of us stop that journey of surrender at exactly this point, the surrender of the will. This is hard for us to do individually. It is even harder for us to do this collectively. Asking God to help us to be involves letting go of our attachments of how things have always been or how we wish they would be. Let me provide you with an analogy. Last year, I was at a conference where the speaker described surrender as follows. Imagine there is a young couple about to be married, and about a week before the wedding, the man says to his fiancée, "I'm really sorry, but there's something I should have told you a long time ago. This is awkward, but here goes. I have 10 girlfriends, and I don't want to let go of any of them, but I still want to marry you." Of course, the woman's furious. She explains that this is not acceptable, and the man replies, "Okay, I'll give up 7, but I'd like to keep 3. So it is on our faith journey. So many of us would love to experience a profound relationship, a connection with God's presence, and yet so many of us, all of us really, hang on to attachments that keep us from genuinely coming fully naked into God's presence. Those attachments could be many things. It could be our need for control. It could be our need for easy answers. It could be our memory of old wounds. It could be our sense of being better than others when it comes to knowing how to follow Jesus. In truth, even our spirituality can become our attachment if we find ourselves worshiping our spirituality rather than really coming vulnerably and naked in the presence of God. Surrender is so hard to do that we experience it as a kind of a death. It is why Jesus said that we must lose our lives in order to find them. It is why the curve is drawn as going down before it comes up. While surrendering the will is hard individually, it is even more difficult collectively as congregations. We become attached to our building, our programs, our self-image, whether good or bad, our theology, who sits where, whether the choir wears robes, what hymnal we sing out of. And this causes me to wonder, when our inner space is crowded with our attachments, whatever they might be, how can God plant wild hope within us? Abiding in Christ. As we fully surrender ourselves to God, as we move down this curve, we are invited to do something that is radically countercultural. We are invited to wait. When was the last time that you were frustrated because your computer was slower than you wanted it to be, or every traffic light was red, or you ended up in the grocery line that took the longest? The spiritual discipline of waiting is so foreign to us, we hardly know its potency. It is a powerful discipline. This is not empty waiting. Quite the opposite. It is like a pregnant waiting, an anticipation that as we wait, God will speak. Or said differently, as we nurture that waiting space, we will begin to become aware. We will notice and discover that God is already among us, waiting to be heard. I remember as a young girl and as a young woman being baffled by the assumption throughout Scripture that God speaks. And yet, in my many years of Sunday school and theological study, I did not really learn any form of prayer or discernment regarding how one might actually nurture an inner spirit that would be capable of hearing the voice of God. Often when I work with congregations, I ask them, how are you listening for God's leading in order to draw on this leading to assist them in whatever situation they are in? Sadly, some congregations genuinely do not understand the question I am asking. I am pleased to say that when I work with Mennonite churches and ask this same question, they at least typically understand the question. Very few congregations, however, have developed the personal or congregational practices in this regard that would help them. In other words, while our congregations know that this is important, the absence of language regarding how to do this, how to discern the Spirit of God, this leaves us adrift at sea. We don't know where to start. How do we engage this discipline? This involves a deep and genuine prayerful listening. I simply know no other way. In the world of spiritual disciplines, this is known as Christian meditation or contemplative prayer. But really, this form of prayer needs no fancy title. It is simply the act of praying where we spend more time in silence, waiting, and listening than we do in talking. It is not an easy form of prayer. In our attempts to be silent before God, we are so often confronted with all that is in us that refuses to be silenced, whether that be to-do lists or old wounds that won't be healed. It is also true that we may not hear God speak while we're in that silent space. Instead, the time that we spend in silence with God becomes our training ground. It readies our soul that we are able to listen for God 24/7, whether we're in the grocery store, in traffic, alone and in silence, or in conversation with a good friend. There is a rather famous story told about a Christian teacher of prayer, Thomas Keating. He had been teaching a group of nuns about how to be inwardly silent as they prayed, and after a 10-minute experiment in this regard, an old nun raised her hand and confessed, "I am terrible at this," she said. "My mind wandered 1,000 times. Keating replied to her, "Aren't you lucky? This means that you were given 1,000 opportunities to return to God." The point is not to do this perfectly. To be truthful, in the world of listening prayer, all of us are beginners, and even the experts refer to themselves as seasoned beginners. The point is to return again and again with open ears to the heart of God, knowing it is in this place that we are being transformed. That we should take time to simply be with God, to listen for how God should speak, should not come as a surprise to us. Jesus, after all, went regularly into the wilderness to pray. The most remarkable of those visits, of course, was the first recorded visit, the one where he fasted 40 days and 40 nights. We know this as the time when he was tempted by the devil. In those 40 days, Jesus engaged the key themes by which any leader would be tempted. You could argue that these key themes are the demons that plague any leader: to work wonders, to be powerful, to control one's destiny. Jesus went into the wilderness with a clear sense that he was called. But in those 40 days, he faced these leadership demons. And when he emerged from that wilderness, he emerged ready to actually engage that call. What would it be like for each of us individually to follow Jesus into that wilderness? What would it be like for us as a church to enter the wilderness together, and in that wilderness, like Jesus, to wrestle with our demons and to listen for God's leading? Like Jesus, we are called to take time away, to spend time with God. But the hard news is that when we do, like Jesus, we will not only encounter God, we will also encounter our demons, our attachments, those things that tempt us to be something or someone other than who we are called to be. Traditionally, the word for attachments was actually sin. I find myself drawn to the word attachments for the simple reason that the word sin does no longer speak to many of us in our context today. The word attachments asks us to take a hard look at those things that we call good that are not good, those things that we call bad that are not bad. We are called to look at those wounds that will not be released. The truth is that we can become quite delusional about the attachments that keep us from fully surrendering to God's leading. Similarly, another word for abiding in Christ is actually conversion. I believe that the word conversion and the concept of conversion has been terribly misused in the church. Conversion is not a one-time event, nor is it an intellectual assent to some faraway truth with the hopes of life eternal. Conversion is a lifelong journey of returning again and again into the heart of God in order to be powerfully and continually transformed into ever greater understanding of who each of us has called to be, of who each of us has been called to be as a child of God. To make matters more complex, this lifelong journey of conversion is not only an individual exercise. It is the same journey that we're being called to walk together as a people of faith. About 20 years ago, I attended a conference called the Women Doing Theology Conference, hosted by what was then Canadian Mennonite Bible College. One of the participants of that event made a comment that I found so profound, I have turned it over and over in my head about 1,000 times. What the speaker said was this: when people ask me whether I have been born again, I say to them, yes, I have spent time in the womb of the divine, and I was born, not a child, but a woman. Yes, I have spent time in the womb of the divine. When did you last spend time in the womb of the divine? How were you transformed in that space? What calling was given to you as you emerged from that warm and protective place? And I wonder, when was your congregation last in the womb of the divine? How was it transformed in that space? What calling was given to your church as it emerged from that womb? Being in the womb of the divine is not simply a place of safety and protection. It is a place of transformation and rebirth. It is a place that we are called to return to again and again. And when we emerge not as children, but instead as increasingly mature persons, increasingly able to reflect to the world the image of God in which we are created. Let us imagine for a moment that we as a people of faith together spent regular time in the womb of the divine. How might that change us? How might we discover together who we are called to be as children of God all over again? Of course, being in the womb of the divine together, it might still happen that we hear God's voice differently from one another. Furthermore, many of us can surely point to examples of individuals and churches that have misused this very thing. They have used their self-declared access to God's voice to harm those around them, to try to kick from God's womb those with whom they do not want to share that space. How do we discern from among the voices that tell us that they have heard God speak, especially when we hear God's voice differently from one another? The temptations of Jesus in the wilderness are remarkable in part because the tempter used very godlike language and images. It would have been easy for Jesus to mess this one up if he had not been discerning well. As I have journeyed with people learning to listen for God's leading collectively, I have noticed the following qualities that seem to allow us to discern God's voice while giving space in the womb of the divine for others with whom we disagree. 1, are we holding our truth with humility? The Apostle Paul says, after all, that we see only dimly and that we know only in part. Are we holding our truth with humility? Are we listening for the truth in voices that differ from us? We are all made in the image of God, and even the most difficult among us carry within them a kernel of truth, a kernel of God's truth for us. 3, is there a sense of synergy emerging? The truth is, we're stuck with each other. In Ephesians 4, the Apostle Paul writes how we're shackled to one another. We are stuck with one another, and when God moves the group forward, God often allows a sense of synergy to emerge. 4, are we experiencing a sense of peace about the direction we're moving, and maybe just a hint of fear? And finally, are we surprised? Does this direction that God is moving us in nurture within us a sense of wild hope? Because in my experience of God's leading, it is usually the surprise that shows me the direction that God is leading me in. It is not something that I anticipated. And finally, the last of the spiritual rhythms on this curve, incarnation. To incarnate is to make flesh. And while we associate this spiritual discipline with Jesus, it is a discipline that applies to each one of us as well. How are we embodying? How are we living into? How are we translating into our lives our experience of encountering God as we have abided in God's presence? This is the million-dollar question, because the world in which we live desperately needs people who have been transformed in this way. How are we embodying? How are we living into? How are we translating into our lives our experience of encountering God as we have abided in God's presence? Because the world in which we live desperately needs people who have been transformed in this way. Several years ago, I heard an idea attributed to Ted Hunter. After World War II, the world was stunned and fell into a deafening silence. Billy Graham spoke into that silence and helped the world to find meaning again. Today, the world is loud, deafeningly loud. It is not unlike being caught in the middle of a great windstorm. For people caught up in the vortex of that noise, the rates of loneliness, suicide, and mental illness are climbing rapidly at an alarming rate. As a result, the longing in our society for hope, connection, meaning, and purpose is growing at a feverish rate. According to Hunter, if after the Second World War the role of the church was to speak into the world's silence, the role of the church today is to embody God's presence in a manner that brings stillness to the world's noise. The role of the church today is to embody God's presence in a manner that brings stillness to the world's noise. Transforming stillness, meaningful stillness, listening stillness, waiting stillness, healing stillness. Stillness that gives space, rest, safety, and hope, even wild hope. Stillness that is infused with compassion and grace. Stillness that invites us churched and non-churched alike, to discover all over again what it means to be children of God, to be made in the image of God. And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them into the boat. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was almost being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." The wind ceased, and there was a great and deep calm. Peace, be still. Be still. Amen.